So for students, can I get you, if you have any questions to ask them, can you post it on the general channel on the Slack? I will take, and with your name I will read it if necessary. But otherwise, I will start with some questions that I prepared. I will take it from. Please use the Slack channel. In the general channel, post the question. So let me start with some initial questions, Professor. So you talked about the block center and projects. I mean, given the audience, I want to know what are the specific research questions or research projects. To name a few at a high level, what are the projects that you are involved in, or your center is
There's
involved in
me
also?
personally. There are 150 faculty at the block center, so there's a large number
Oh,
of
okay, okay. Just few. What are the
faculty.
top five projects or
Yeah,
something? Yeah,
yeah. So maybe I can just highlight
yeah.
a few of them. And PK, I should point out that we're very proud of you as a CMU alum as well. So this is great that
No,
you're
no, no.
there at IIT, which is that's my alma mater as well. So it's great to be have you be there at IIT Madras. In terms of the center, I think one very practical project that we have ongoing is actually this partnership with the state that I mentioned, which is with the state of Pennsylvania on the use of generative AI in government decision making. So there, I think they're just beginning the project of trying to identify how to actually prioritize and identify use cases, primarily internal facing use cases, not citizen facing use cases, internal facing use cases that lend themselves to the use of generative AI. And in that, all of the points that I just made, from problem formulation to identifying, what kinds of data governance they need. So it's a policy and technology oriented
Sure.
project. I think that's an interesting project. The second, I think, is this issue of going from AI to AI agents. Now, this is more of a technical project, which has to do with how do you assess the reliability of AI agents. There's a much broader question of how do you do measurement and evaluation of AI,
Yeah.
period, and then of AI agents. This is actually an initiative that we've been fairly deeply engaged with NIST on, with the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And I think they range from questions related to, how do you actually do evaluation of AIs, especially of deep learning, transformer architecture, Gen AI type AIs. I think and we can delve deeper into specific questions there. That's a big project. And then the last one that I'll sort of highlight is the work that we're doing on open source. Being able to come up with the equivalent of, like there are these transparency indices that colleagues from Princeton, Arvind Narayan, and actually he's an IIT Madras alum as well, from Princeton and Stanford, have done for open source. What does it mean to be open source in AI? If you think of that question, that I think is a really interesting question, and how one can then think about what kind of open sourceness you need for the purposes of evaluation. So there's a big focus on evaluation in the responsible AI side. There's also a major project on future of work, which has to do with how do you think about how skills are going to likely be augmented or substituted with the deployment of AI. And what does that then mean for people, for firms, for policymakers? We have a project called the Workforce Supply Chain Project that looks at that in some detail.
Sure.
So anyway, that's a little flavor of some of the things that we're doing.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for that. So the next question is one of the favorite questions that probably for today we have been talking from morning is that, so AGI, what are your take on AGI? When do you see it coming? If it comes, what will it be? Any thoughts on that?
So AGI is like beauty, I guess. It's in the eye of the beholder. I don't know what AGI means, to be honest. So I'd like first a definition of what AGI is. So I guess I belong more to the camp of um, I'd like to see how AIs evolve and grow and change and grow in capability over time, and how, as they grow in capability, we determine how best they can be deployed in ways that improve productivity, that actually allow us to do things that are societally consequential in climate change or in drug discovery or education, things of that nature. I'm personally not that. I'm either neither am I a betting person to say we'll see AGI in 10 years and here's what is going to be. So I'm less interested in that question, because one of the definitional question, the other is that I see there are lots of issues regarding how to get AI and get the most of it, most out of it right now with what we have today, and how do we seed the appropriate growth of AI and deployment of AI in ways that can be societally beneficial.
Sure. So the next question is about governments. I'll probably connect it with one of the questions that Gautam has also asked, which is you talked about these three different models, right? Market-based, human right-based, and state-focused based things. So one is, what are the governments doing for intergovernmental? I think you spoke a little bit about what US is doing, what Europe is doing, what China is doing. And I remember seeing you also in India giving some presentations in Delhi about this topic. So what are intergovernmental discussions that are going on? That's first part. Second is, for India, what are these three models that you discussed? Which one would work? How would it work?
So that's a big question and a good one. I think certainly with regard to how governments are seeking to work with one another. That example I gave of OpenAI, SAP, HR application, and its actual deployment, you could imagine that spans international boundaries. The OpenAI is a US company. It might be hosting the AI in some server in California. And SAP is a German company, which is maybe created an HR application, and then in city of Pittsburgh or maybe city of Hamburg or wherever in Germany, let's say, deploys it. So these AI value chains may span multiple jurisdictions. So that's sort of the first question is, what is it that government is trying to do across governmental boundaries? One is to allow for trade across jurisdictions, right? So what kinds of trade might actually come about? Some of them are actually taking place, right? It's not like AI is some separate entity, because you find that the first examples of AI that most people are going to see are just going to be AI being bundled with enterprise applications or productivity enhancing applications. So for instance, I don't know if the students already have access to Google Docs and Office 365, if they're using Microsoft Word, PowerPoint, etc.
They do.
So, Copilot has now been integrated with all of this, right? So is Copilot with Microsoft now, quote unquote, an AI? Yes, it is. Or Copilot with Word. Is it an AI? Yes, it is. But for most people, that's where they'll encounter AI. That is, they will just use it with their enterprise apps and for their productivity enhancing apps. I think where the specialized applications come about, I think these questions of obligations of the sort that I mentioned, where let's say that somebody used an HR application or a healthcare application that featured AI that actually committed an error. What is the obligation of SAP in that case? And can SAP answer a regulator's question about why that error was committed without compliance and partnership from OpenAI or Google? So now you're asking what not only how does value and information flow down the chain, but how do obligations flow up the chain if there are error. So what governments are trying to do is trying to put in place these kinds of agreements um, to ensure that you have these kinds of trade that cross boundaries. A very interesting example that's going to emerge in my view is compute is going to become a tradable resource. So if you have NVIDIA based data centers, and if you're a country that has a lot of energy, could you set up data centers in those countries and then trade in services, compute services? I think you could have it at that level. You could have it at the level of, so think of this as a stack where you have compute, you have data, you have model, you have applications. You could have trade in every one of these layers. And for having that, you need some harmonization of policies, but also of frameworks. This is where the AI risk management framework that NIST has come up with is being widely adopted. I think last week, Singapore and the US signed an agreement where the AI verify architecture and the US AI RMF, there's a crosswalk between the two.
Okay.
So I expect these kinds of crosswalks to take place between what different countries have. Now, with regard to India, I was at GPI in India in Delhi in December. Actually, Ravi co-chairs one of the committees along with Secretary Krishnan, who is the current IT Secretary of India. I was honored to be invited to sit in on their policy deliberations. I think India, in contrast to say China or the EU or the US, I think there is something in progress. I don't believe, at least to the best of my knowledge, there is the equivalent of an AI Act that has actually come out. If anything, I see India perhaps leaning more towards a market-based approach versus a EU-based approach. Now, of course, companies that serve different markets will have to comply with if you're going to serve the European market, you're going to have to comply with the EU AI Act. And this is true for not just Indian companies, it's true for American companies. And just like with privacy, which is an area that you know a lot about, PK, where there was the so-called Brussels effect, I expect that the EU's AI Act will have the Brussels effect in terms of having companies that want to serve the large European market choosing to just comply with it. And alongside that, that's what they will make available in their other markets as well. So I think it's an evolving and an interesting space.
Great. So let me go to your personal journey question. So your career also has been starting with engineering, then policy. I'm sure there are many other topics, but some things that I picked up: management science. Now you're doing. So how do you? What is your thought on transitioning from sort of say one domain to another domain? What skills generally? Because one of the questions also student asked was, look, I'm a CS student, but I'm actually more interested in the AI policy research. What are the things that I should do? I took that question and slightly abstracted it to things that you have done. So yeah, can you walk us through your transition a bit and then give us some suggestions and ideas about how to do these transitions?
Yeah, so I think actually IIT prepared me very well because I think there is the engineering mindset that you acquire. And I was a mechanical engineer when I studied at IIT, almost 35 years ago. I think my first exposure to optimization actually took place at IIT. At that time, we didn't have CS, interestingly. I'm that old. Actually, before CS existed as a bachelor's at IIT Madras. We did have a course on software engineering or programming, but we had a lot of math. And I chose operations research. My master's and my PhD were actually in optimization and operations research, with minors in computer science and statistics. So that combo of optimization and computing and statistics just turned out there's a lot of luck here as well. Serendipitously, that combo of optimization, statistics, and computing was actually positioned me very well for everything to come in machine learning and AI. And AI and operations research were sibling disciplines that came out of World War II. So I was cross-trained in those disciplines at Texas before I went to CMU. And at CMU, as you know, I was fortunate to, my first PhD student was with Herb Simon. So I was sort of fully inculcated, I guess, in the multidisciplinary approach that existed at CMU. So I think the transition piece with regard to AI policy came about, I think, on account of the fact that while I'd been doing technology and technology policy related stuff using data-driven methods, I guess the AI policy essentially brought together many of the things that I'd been working on. So, and I was fortunate to serve on the Presidential Advisory Committee, et cetera. I think the big takeaway for me is always be intellectually curious. So I think that is something that has stood me in good stead. I think the foundation that you all are getting in your undergraduate programs, and then the subsequent things that you're choosing to do, I think it's good to have some in-depth knowledge of something, and then I'll say be cross-trained in one other thing. So this is like, I don't know, to use a policy metaphor, like China plus one strategy, you should have your CS plus one strategy, or your have plus one. So you should know something really well and then be plus one on something. And the question is, what should that plus one be? It's really your interest that should drive that. And I think that will stand you in good stead.
Great, great, great. So, yeah. So the next question is, you talked about the projects that the center is doing, and 150 plus faculty are working on this. So this question is from one of the students saying, what is going to be the most path-breaking research or work in the next couple of years, if there is, if not one, at least a couple of them, according to you?
You know, that's a really good question. If you're, you know, personally speaking, I've been actually, it's like being back as an undergraduate in some ways. I was familiar with Vaswani's transformer paper when it came out. You know, I read the paper when it came out. I had seen GPT-2 when it came out. But if you had asked me at that point, predict for me what would have happened from GPT-2 to where we are at today, I would have gotten it totally wrong. In the sense that I think it's been just remarkable, the pace and the rate of change for the capability of the AI, both in terms of what you all have witnessed with regard to, and I have witnessed with regard to what generative AI is capable of. So I tend not to want to make speculative statements about this is the most transformative thing that's coming, because I know I'll be wrong. But that said, I think there's going to be some really interesting developments in terms of combining AIs with what they can do on a device without any connection to the cloud. So if you think about most AIs today, we access them over the network. We get access to them over cloud-based services. So if you think of this as like a two-dimensional sort of matrix, on-premise on cloud, or on-device on cloud, and pre-training and inference, I think you're going to see on-device, fully disconnected from the network, inference capabilities going to be quite remarkable. That is, even these small models on a device with the limitations that a phone or a iPad might have are going to be capable of doing things that are really going to be quite significant, and therefore is going to create a whole bunch of new application opportunities that you all are going to benefit from, either in terms of startups or research ideas or new opportunities where you have this capacity to deploy AI on a device. And I think that's one. The other, I think, is going to be a need to solve for this AI and energy puzzle. I think AI is a huge consumer of energy, and therefore is part of the problem. It also is a contributor to solutions to come up with new and clever ways of dealing with decarb, if you will, of decarbonization. So I think AI and energy is a big opportunity area, I think, both for the good and
Sure.
bad, as I just outlined. But then AI on devices disconnected from the network, I think, is where I expect a big step forward.
Sure. I think we're going to have Sriram from UT Dallas, and then Anand Raghunathan from Purdue. All of them speaking in the summer school in the next 3-4 days. I know they are going to. Some of them are going to touch upon this power and AI and all that. So it's fantastic to hear from you that that's one of the topics that we should look out for. So now one question from the content that you presented. So you said that this quality of service part, and you said xenoml.com. So who will decide what should be the quality of service? So is
And
it
this is a
the
great question. So, I mean, is it policy? Is it the community? Is it something that um, individuals? So I think, we collectively as a community can decide what our values are, right? Do we want quality? What do we want the quality of service to be? Or you can require public policy to make these assessments. Um, I expect that there will be differences in the European context, let's say, versus the US context here. In the US, I think more of a market-based approach will emerge to coming up with, whether it should be aspirational, whether it should be reflective of what the data tell us what's going on today. And in other cases, it might be actually specified by policy, which is more the European approach. And I think it depends on the application context. I mean, the examples that I showed you of the kindergarten teacher or the college professor, um, but if you think about other kinds of images that you want to generate that potentially could manipulate public opinion and behavior, should there be limits placed? In the US, there's a very strong freedom of expression right that's enshrined in the Constitution. So I think there are going to be jurisdiction-specific choices that are made. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all to your answer.
Sure. Okay, so the next question is, so how do we trust? I think the question is around government, so I'm going to add the industry also as part of the question. So how do we trust industry, government with data, say when the model needs to be black, gray box to normal public, some of the things that you talked about. But how do we trust these companies or even the government when they take the data from us?
Yeah, I mean, the evidence right now is actually, I mean, let me give you two examples, right? So I don't know how many people use WhatsApp. I assume a vast number of you do. Like
Yeah,
show of hands, I think the
yeah.
majority
Probably.
of you use
There's
WhatsApp, right?
nobody in this room who's not on WhatsApp, I guess.
Yeah. So if you're on WhatsApp, if you're on Insta or Facebook or any of these kinds of social media companies, they have access to your data and behavior. And what we have done is we have given them that access in exchange for quote unquote free access to a service, right? There's no such thing as free. So I think the trade-off is that you've basically given access to your private data in exchange for access to the service. This is equally true of what with Google search, for instance. So this whole advertising-based model effectively requires you to exchange data for service. Now, if you take Aadhaar in India, that's providing a vast amount of personal data that's individually identifiable with the government. But if you look at the India stack, it enables a number of services. If you take, the entire UPI and the capabilities that have been made possible, I want you to contrast what access in the US, for instance, there's no such thing as Aadhaar, but the companies own all the data about individuals, and then they charge for access to that data to create an ecosystem of partners. In India, you have to trust the government with Aadhaar data, but then the India stack allows for that layer, the foundation layer, which is biometrically providing individually identifiable access to individual data, with layers above that with protocols like MOSIP. And on top of that, you have, a UPI, which then allows for private sector competition to come in to offer things like Paytm and Google Pay and Phone Pay and all these other companies that are competing to provide access to services, but without owning the data about the individual. So if you draw a line between who provides a service and who owns access to the data about the individual, the line in India was drawn where the government said, we'll own the data, and we will create a public um, infrastructure. It's a digital public good that will be created. And then the private sector can compete in provisioning of service, but they can't own the data about the individuals. The US, because people don't like giving data to the government, doesn't have the equivalent of an Aadhaar, but individual companies have grown very wealthy by creating very large repositories of data about people and then creating services that are layered on top. So you get the growth of these very large oligopolies, if you will, in this model, in contrast to what's happened in India. So I think you have to repose trust in either the firm or the government. You could use blockchain, arguably, to say you'll have totally distributed ledger and trust models. I'm not convinced that economically that is going to actually play out, though there have been a number of papers written about that. So to your question, PK, I think we are sort of in one of these two regimes. And there could be intermediate regimes, maybe the technology could enable, but at the present time, it's even whether you know it or not, you're trusting one or the other.
Yeah, sure. But it's interesting that you're saying this is more from seeing both the US life a bit and India, that too when Aadhaar discussion all started. You're saying that nothing like that exists in the US, but SSN number is generally what the parallels that people say as Aadhaar as. I'm
But
curious.
but there's no biometric identification with SSN.
Right.
So it's easy to spoof. In contrast, I think Aadhaar has much stronger guarantees about identifiability, and that's one of the reasons why you have things like UPI or the health stack work, because you have individual identifiability.
Sure.
In fact, in Africa, they're trying to deploy the India stack, but without investing in what Aadhaar requires. And I think you'll have to give up some guarantees on individual identifiability. So you can deploy using MOSIP. But if you don't have MOSIP plus the biometrics, you don't get the very high levels of individual identifiability guarantee that Aadhaar gives you.
Sure.
So it's a trade-off.
Yeah, next question is interesting question. So this is regarding AI literacy. The student says that I've gone through all the 5 recommendations given by US National Advisory Committee, but in the context of India, where digital literacy is low and even the digital divide is there, what are components that we should focus on for AI literacy campaign so that AI divide should not happen?
This is actually a huge problem in the US itself, by the way. That's why there's a big effort on AI literacy. And there's also a question of fear that people have about AI that stems from their lack of knowledge about AI and being susceptible to either statements that there's going to be AGI and you're going to be all out of work, or there's going to be this or that. I think, the digital divide part, one could argue that with geo and with widespread deployment of mobile-based internet access in India, I mean, India is among the cheapest data rates in the world. Maybe that's the place to start. With one is just pure access, to the internet. The second, I think, and this goes to my point about, can we reduce the cost of making AIs available either on device or in ways that it's much cheaper to deploy than it is presently, because it's too expensive right now to do it at scale. And third, I think we need to provide people with simple, compelling ways in their own language. I think this is where Bhashini and the work of IIT Madras and the Indian government is particularly relevant. Do it in your own language. Do it in Tamil or in Malayalam or Telugu or Hindi or whatever your native language is. And at the same time, can you tie it to things that matter to people? You know, be it agriculture, education for children. You know, if you take Khan Academy, I don't know if you've seen Khan
Yeah,
Amigo
yeah.
in action. Um, it's a very compelling example of how AI combined with education can actually make a difference. How many of you used Khan Academy while you're growing up? Did you? Many of you use Khan Academy?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So if not, check it out. So if you add Khan Academy plus AI Tutor, which is what Khan Amigo is, that's a great example, especially in India where we have the need for larger numbers of. So if you change the scale equation where a single teacher can actually working with something like Khan Amigo work with a larger number of kids, I think that's going to really, there are so many kids that didn't have they don't have the privilege of education that all of you have had, that I've had. That in India, I think there are so many kids in rural areas that would benefit from technology like this, that I think it behooves us to create a version of Khan Amigo for deployment in India. So AI literacy is at multiple levels, as I've noted, but I think at its core, it should have a set of applications that people are excited about and see that as a potential for why AI makes sense for them in ways that are meaningful to them, their children, their livelihoods. I think critical. And do it in a way that they don't need to do it in English. They can do it in their own mother tongue.
Sure. The next one is with respect to AI research and the way things are going. So, do you? I think arms race is a word that we have heard a couple of times in the summer school in the last 6 days. Do you see AI, so to say, as a arms research for future, similar to weapons of war?
So, I chair the DoD's RAI Academic Council. So, there is without a doubt, I think if you even see what's happening in the Israel-Gaza war, or if you look at what's going on in Ukraine-Russia, you're seeing the use of various kinds of AIs combined with drone technology and the like as weapons of war. So, as with any technology, I think you're going to see this technology being used both for offensive capabilities, for information warfare, cyber warfare, a whole bunch of different things that this technology is likely going to be used in. That said, I think there is very much a sense that especially the Chinese and the US, China and the US. In fact, if you look at what Joshua Bengio, the Turing Award winner, has articulated as the need for the equivalent of a treaty between the US and China around, like nuclear non-proliferation.
Yeah.
So I think I expect something like that. Second, I think in the second thing that might be interesting to read is Kai-Fu Lee, who's another CMU alum, who ran Google in China and Microsoft as well in China, has written a very interesting book about, the idea that you have the Chinese model, the US model, and you have to subscribe to one or the other. I think the Kai-Fu Lee book and the Joshua Bengio articles, I think, are worth reading.
Sure. Okay, so the next one is more like the RAI question, which is recently companies like OpenAI have sort of say, taken data from Reddit and other platforms, and therefore this bias is there in the pre-training model. Right? How can we address sort of say representation problem of people who don't share their data or active on other social platforms? So data that these models are taking Meaning probably the student whoever is asked the question is not on social. So how is their views getting represented in these models, or how should
Yeah,
it
I
be?
mean, yeah, and without a doubt, I think there is a broader representation, how representative the data are. Um, and if you have either segments of population or even countries that are not digital, or even certain languages that aren't adequately digitally represented, implicitly when we think of Reddit, we're thinking in English. Even if some take a bigger version of the problem, let's say for the sake of discussion, we're thinking about Reddit in, I mean, I don't know, pick a language that is not as digitized. Um, then how would AI content, if it's not digitized, how do I then train these transformers in using you know, data that doesn't exist? So that then creates representation problems. That's one of the reasons why I think it's really important for sovereign AIs to be created. So I think it's really important for India to create its own AI to ensure that there is enough representation of its own data sources. And particularly because we have so many languages in India, I think it's important that we create an AI and not just depend on the Googles or the Anthropics or the Metas and the Open AIs of the world.
Sure. So the next one is more like the career question, which is if I were starting or if I am finishing the summer school or getting a degree in data science, what are your suggestions? What kind of things that should look for? I think the question is specifically about how do I make more money, but yeah, what should I look for?
Making more money is not a bad thing. It's all right. It's perfectly reasonable. So I think first and foremost, I think you know, you really have to pursue something that you're super excited about. I think there's going to be a huge opportunity in how to operationalize AI. You know, if you think about, you know, you see all this announcement every couple of weeks about some small language model or large language model or whatever is on Hugging Face. I don't think that's where the action is. I think the action is on saying, how do I actually take AIs, and if I'm a firm, how do I actually put it to work in ways that are beneficial to the firm? Or if I'm thinking about creating a startup, you know, what would be a problem that I need to address that I can use using AI? So I would really think, if you think of this as a pyramid, I think the AI innovation part is at the top of the pyramid. But the bottom of the pyramid, where there are so many more opportunities, are in terms of taking the AI and operationalizing it. Meaning, how do I actually make the railways run better, or the health to be delivered better, or education to be done better, or if you are interested in selling soaps or whatever else, how might Hindustan Lever do its job better? You know, you could take any firm. I think every firm needs to figure out how it's going to use AI. I think there's going to be opportunities there in terms of how to operationalize AI. I think that's really where there's a big opportunity. But I think there are lots of entrepreneurial opportunities that are going to come to pass.
Yeah,
And it really depends on what you're excited about.
sure. So the next one is connected to something that you spoke. So as a policymaker, how important are fairness scores for allowing deployment of Gen AI models for public welfare?
You kind of broke up there. How
Yeah, yeah.
important are fairness?
Scores for allowing deployment of Gen AI models for public welfare.
So I think the key question is, when we talk about public welfare, it'd be good to be more specific about what applications are we talking about. I mean, if you're talking about, you know, public services, are you talking about credit granting, as in loan granting? Is it about employment? You know, you can think about public welfare arising in each of these different cases. So as I mentioned earlier, I think this issue of what thresholds are going to be set um, and deemed acceptable are either going to come from law that already exists on the books, like with fair credit reporting, or with employment, things of that nature, which are designed to be anti-discriminatory. And I think the issues of evaluating not just fairness, but even robustness, reliability, etc., will all come from either laws or from the firms that are choosing to deploy it, setting thresholds. So that's where it's going to come.
Yeah, great. Thanks. So the next question is about sort of say regulation. Let me just read it as is from the student. Why do you think the enforcement of laws in AI industry is yet to materialize, contrasted to traffic laws being enforced in tune with the industry's growth? What is causing this delay in AI regulation?
So, I mean, you have to distinguish between horizontal versus vertical regulation in AI, right? So, when you think about, when I say vertical regulation, I think there's existing laws that already exist, for instance, for employment, for fair credit, things of that nature, where the existing laws with additional tweaks can be used to regulate AI. There's no AI exception. So, let's say I was using AI in granting loans. And if the AI made errors, you can't say, you know what, it wasn't my problem. The AI made a mistake. There is no AI exception to complying with laws that already exist. So the first thing is not to think of AI regulation as something brand new, but existing laws, because AI is going to be deployed in so many different sectors. There are existing laws governing the delivery of services in those sectors, that the first step is to ask yourself what existing laws with tweaks can actually govern the use of AI in that particular sector. That's called vertical regulation. Horizontal regulation is of the sort that the EU AI Act has been trying to promulgate, which looks at, are your use cases high risk, medium risk, low risk, or totally inappropriate to use. They don't, for instance, permit private organizations from using surveillance. The government can use it for law and order purposes, but private companies cannot use AIs to surveil people. That's an example where the technology is available but is not permitted to be used. Those are horizontal kinds of things, independent of particular vertical application domain. So I think where the delay is happening is the recognition that you want to balance innovation with governance, and the jurisdictions that have chosen not to have horizontal regulation are doing so expressly with the intent to say we want the innovation to happen, and our existing laws will govern the application of AIs in those particular sectors while letting the horizontal work itself out. So that's where we are in terms of horizontal versus vertical.
Okay, sure. Last couple of questions and then we can wrap up. I think all of us understand that these models are making a lot of errors and fatal mistakes sometimes. In the last 6 days, again, we have seen speakers give us examples of where all these models have failed. So the question is, who should be penalized, and how can we penalize in order to maintain law and order?
So I think this goes back to the question is, where there is existing law, then I think the pathway to, so I don't know what examples you had of AIs creating errors that resulted in deaths, etc., that were left unpunished. I don't know what examples people gave you. The most common examples people bring up are things like the Compass examples.
Yes, we saw that.
Yeah, but it's a good example to use. But I think, in my view, that's an example, for instance, in criminal justice, of asking the question, what's the right fairness metrics to use? Should it be the positive predictive value equivalence across black and white versus false prediction rates between black and white, which is really where that
Yes.
whole stream of work came about. And that led to white defendants getting less time or being assumed to have lower likelihood of recidivism than black defendants. So my sense is, in those examples, I think there is a very clear case to be made that when you use an AI, you need to do not only more due diligence, but you have to have a better understanding of what fairness metric should be used, number one. Second, to recognize there's a fairness impossibility theorem that says you cannot achieve all types of fairness metrics
Yeah,
simultaneously.
yeah, we saw that
Uh,
also. Yeah.
yeah. So I think the issue is one of really trying to figure out which fairness metrics makes the most sense to deploy. And fairness is one of a collection of metrics. Remember, there's efficiency, fairness, and this is the responsible AI principles. So in that setting, it's about decision support for judges and how do we deploy it responsibly in a way where the judges are aware when to use the recommendation of the AI and when to overrule it appropriately. When should it be used purely in decision support setting? When should it be used in an automated setting? So all these kinds of questions about human in the loop versus human not being in the loop, that's really where this issue of assessment of is it reliable enough to deploy comes up. And I think they have to be done in ways where it's quite clear that the cost of the error and who bears the cost of the error is made very clear. And if they're doing it in sectors where there is existing law, then the cost of the error is going to be borne not just by the citizen, but also by the organization that's actually deploying the AI. So there, I think your incentives are aligned. I think the problem arises where your AI is deployed and it is sort of the wild, wild west, and there isn't either a way to ensure that we have a measurement that says who's harmed and who's going to be held liable for the harm. I think that's when you have a problem of the sort that AI is deployed and it either creates an error that, for which nobody goes unpunished, which means then you don't have the right system in place for you to actually deploy the AI. So I think to your question of, rather than answer this question by saying, here is where the AI is being used irresponsibly and it's creating all these problems, and here is where it is being used responsibly, I would frame this differently in the way that I just did.
Sure, sure. Okay, last question. I know it's 9:30. So the last question is, so this is again taking from the deck that you had. You spoke about this quality of services. So this the question is, what are your personal thoughts on current state versus aspirational state? Where would you like to be, or what would be your sort of say expectations of that?
Yeah, so one, it depends on context, but I'm also a believer in the fact that we are not working in a static system. So it's not a question of my giving you an answer and saying that that answer I've given you has no impact on the future state of the system. So think of if this is being deployed at scale, meaning the AI is being deployed at scale, then what happens at time t is going to affect the system at time t plus one. So I'm in favor of the more aspirational answer rather than giving an answer that is purely based on what the current state is. But it depends on context. If somebody is asking a question, give me the images based on current data. If that's the prompt, then you have to give them the current data answer. But on the other hand, if the prompt is tell me what this is, something that actually motivates young kids who are 5 or 6 years old about the kinds of careers they can have, you want to give them an aspirational answer because you're looking at a dynamic system and not a static system. So that's how I would think of it.
Sure. Yeah, okay. Thank you. I think there are a few more questions, but in the interest of time, we will stop here. And thanks again for your fantastic sort of setting up of the slides as in background and answering all the questions in detail. Thanks for taking time and have a nice day.
No, thank you very much for the invitation, and I wish you all a good evening and a good summer school.
Yeah,
Thank you for doing it. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.